everybody. Today we're going to talk about how to make or apply dynamic fields. So these are fields which are dynamically created on the front end and they're pushed from the back end basically, or defined in the backend endpoint. So here's again our example, our customer application. So I'll double click on that to open the customer details. As you can see here, our already existing application. So I'm going to now add here below some dynamic fields basically. So let's go ahead and go to our customer details application and just take the dynamic fields control and just or object and just place that here. So of course we're going to link it to the form, and we're going to specify the endpoint which is used to build the dynamic fields. So in my case it is dynamic fields per language. So what I prepared is a endpoint which basically will create an input field dynamically for each and every language in our app languages table. So that's all I do. I'll save that and then I'll have a look here. I'll refresh the page. There you see I have a splitter. I've created here a splitter dynamically with 2 columns, and I have a input field per language. So of course I could create a splitter with 3 columns as well if I needed to. Now let's have a look at the endpoint which I've created. I've named it dynamic fields per language. Basically, it will return me a temp table with dynamic fields, and this is the layout. I have a sorting sequence number, I have the control name, the control type, which is input, drop down, or whatever. I have the parent control name and the parent control container. For example, if this is an input record, the parent could be a splitter with container number 1 or 2. Then I have the data source field, which this control is linked to. And then I have potentially, depending on the type of control, input data source data, items data source filter, attributes like, label, bold, etc. And maybe some rules which need to be applied whenever it's rendered. So that's my layout of my temp table. My TT result obviously is my result table, which will give you potentially errors back. And then here I'm not using any template includes. I'll just define my data set the same way I do that in my temp table, in my framework includes. And I have one output parameter, which is the dataset name. Next, I'll set some a certain path so that the front-end framework understands which table to take and which is the dataset name and which table to use. And if that all goes well, I don't get any TT result records here in this procedure, which is in the memory. And here it starts. These are the potential query string parameters which I might receive. So the app name is passed, potentially the data source field, the form group, if I want to link it to a certain form group, the number of columns for my potentially splitter, and this is how I fetch the data from the query string. This is all known stuff. We've covered that before. Here I'm setting some default values if the number of columns is not passed or it's bigger than 3, I'll put that to 3 because the splitter can have maximum 3 columns. So I don't think I need a buffer. so I'll delete that. Next, the first thing I'll do dynamically, or at least I create a temp table for that, is to create a splitter. So if I pass a certain form group name, then I'll include that into my control name, because I want to be able to reuse the same endpoint, maybe for other fields, other purposes as well. So, and to be able to use the same dynamic fields and the same endpoints on the same app, I could link them to different form groups, which then makes the names unique, which is necessary for the framework to understand which object is which. So the control type here is splitter, and the attributes passed is, in this case, the type horizontal containers, and the number of containers type horizontal, and auto width is true. Then here I can do basically whatever I want, and in this example I did a simple for each on my app language, and I'm switching here my containers 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3, and then next row, etc. And then here, this is the part which basically creates my input field, as you can see. So again, I'm repeating more or less the same thing. I'm using the form group as part of the name. I'm saying it's the description minus, and then I'll use the language code to make it unique, English, French, Dutch, etc. And then here I'm saying, okay, which is my what is my parent control name, which I created here on top. This is my parent control name, which I'll reuse here. And then of course the container ID of my parent, which to use, and a sorting sequence number, which I'll simply use the language number for. Now the data source is in my case the form. So the form will be added here because I pass it in a query string, and the form field I haven't specified, but if it's empty in my example, I want to link it to the field description, and I want to use a certain extent. So this way I could just create one field in my record get called description with, let's say, extent 20, and then it will be properly fetched from the database and saved with the record set as well. Next, what I can also pass here are some attributes, like any attribute depending on the object type. So label, I'm passing here the label. I'm passing here the fact that it's an input field, and maybe it's also data type string. I'm saying that it's mandatory false, and in this case, because it's an input field, I don't want a button container for my input field. Obviously, I could basically also put here drop-down lists, and you know, assign the lists to the endpoint which builds the list in one of the fields which is meant for that. So as you can see, it's pretty straightforward. All we do is build a temp table, and then we'll simply let the framework do the work. So of course, what I also need to do here in the record get is add an additional field, description, and I can do as character extent 20, for example. So if I want to populate this, I can, and it will be displayed. So let's see. I'll just manually populate it, assign, and then I'll say tt customer dot description 1 equals Peter, and I'll do maybe also a number 2, which is let's say Max. So that's for my record get. So I expect when I render the screen to see Peter in the first field and Max in the second field. And then in my record set, I have to obviously also add this field in my record set as well. So I'll go to my record set and I'll add it here. So I could then validate on that in let's say the validate procedure. Here on the validation procedure, I could validate on that, and in the save procedure, I could do something with the description, save it to some other table or whatever, doesn't matter. So let's have a look again. Here, I'll do F5, refresh. Here you go, the first extent was linked to English, and it displays Peter because this value comes from the record get, and this value is a second extent. One small thing I forgot to mention, that the front end can use extents, but this one is important. The first extent in progress is extent 0 in the front end. So in all other languages except OpenEdge or Progress, extent starts with 0, and that's why we have to assign that to a 0 extent. Now, if you want to have a look how that looks like in the developers, I'll do F12 here. Oops. So I'll simply refresh the page. Record get. Okay, so this is the record get, and the response, as you can see here, is the description with 2 extents. So it's actually very straightforward to create dynamic fields. The same technology is used in our filters, which we create dynamically. You can create any object dynamically, even tabs, and populate even tabs. It's not an issue at all. So I hope you enjoy that, and I'll talk to you next time.